My name is Kat Self. I work for MITRE. For those of you that have heard of ATT&CK, who has heard of ATT&CK in here? That makes my heart happy. Thank you. All right, so a little bit about me. I used to be a former artist that obviously did really well. I'm here. So now I basically just find opportunities to present where I can support other artists. So a lot of the artwork that you'll see in this presentation is going to be by miscreants. Chris Fleming specifically is the artist, so definitely give props to him. I already sent a tweet out to them. But I also I'm a military intelligence veteran. Even though it's an oxymoron, I was able to get a computer science degree after I got out of the military, went and got hired on at Target, where I was able to learn how to be an internal red teamer, threat hunter, and software developer. And now I get the great opportunity to be at ATT&CK, where I am the macOS lead. And for those of you that are part of the vendor stack and have gone through the painful process of attack evaluations, I'm the person you get to blame for the adversaries. And so yeah, a little bit about me. So what we're going to cover, I really wanted to make this accessible for you all. Last year, Adam Pennington and I did a talk on ATT&CK where it was the different ways to use ATT&CK, whether you're a defender, whether you're apparently an adversary that was discovered in a leak that they're using ATT&CK too, or you're an actual red teamer that wants to do true adversary emulation. So this talk, what I'm going to kind of try to cover is a fun analogy, kind of at a high level to procedure level, on different ways to kind of use ATT&CK or find those techniques in the wild. Most of the techniques that we're going to be talking about are ones that I just updated. So thank you to OBTS. Basically, a lot of the community here has really been incredibly supportive, and you guys can definitely pat yourselves on the back because ATT&CK is for sure better as a result of you all. All the researchers in this room, we have a lot of Twitter and Slack conversations. You guys review a lot of these techniques. Some of you in here are going to see these draft states. Disclaimer, the names of these techniques, some of these at the end, they might change because they are in draft state. We'll be releasing them on the 25th of this month. So what is ATT&CK? For the 3 hands that did not raise their hand, ATT&CK is an open source common knowledge base. It's based on real world, right? So only when an adversary has not only done it, but it has been published. Now to give you guys an idea of that timeline, when something is done in the wild, like we're talking about a lot of these exploits, the timeline between when that exploit is actually used in the wild versus when that exploit is then reported by a company in a published report, that everyone can access, is a pretty good amount of time. Most companies have a policy where they don't really report anything as far as behaviors for the adversaries until it's been compromised by multiple different ones of their clients, so they don't give anything away. So there's a good amount of time. So if it's in ATT&CK, you should for sure care about it. Another big portion of ATT&CK is that it's free, it's open, it's globally accessible. We even try to make it in a level of the English language that it's easily translatable. But it's also a common language. So the way ATT&CK started was you had a red team and a blue team, and they were like, how do we talk about this? How do we have the same language on these different techniques? Is a malicious binary the same thing as GDME? Is an embedded payload the same thing? Or do you just think an embedded payload is a Mako file inside of an application bundle, right? So we all have these different ideas in our head. So it's a common language. It's also community driven. So I'm going to go through this super fast since I already did this last year. But to level set, tactics in ATT&CK, I took this off of the Navigator. It has this great picture option in the Navigator. So for those of you that hate the eye chart, use the camera option on the Navigator. But these are the tactics, right? This is the overall goal, is I want to go to a burger, right? Or go grab a burger to eat. That is my ultimate goal, right? I want to move laterally, ultimate goal. The way in which I do that is going to be the technique. Do I take a car? Do I walk? What does that look like? And then when you get down to the sub-technique, in this case, we're talking about an auto start, right, at login. The sub-technique is going to be login items. And that'll be I took this route, and that is how I got there. Just kind of give you a really high-level overview of what that means. So the way this translates to procedure examples is, thank you, OBTS. Last year, they went over Green Lambert, Runa, and Patrick did, which then made it into ATT&CK just a couple months later. And so those procedures are going to be okay, this is the way in which they did this, this is the software. So that's kind of where we'll be today. Now, come the artwork. The kind of premise of this comic book story that I came up for you guys with is basically you have Pandas, general adversary. Then you have the macOS operating system and the servers. So that's going to be your Kung Fu masters. And then you have the unicorn, and just like in Harry Potter, it's going to be your pure app that's not malicious. And then you have your helper daemons, right? So just to set the premise, the overall story is basically like Panda is going to try to take the Jade Tally. For those of you that don't know and are not super into Kung Fu movies like I am, it's okay. There's still hope for you. But the tallies are kind of like, think about it like as a certificate, right? Like if you have that, you can then have all the power to do all the things. So the Panda wants the tally. So there was a conversation on Twitter, and I want to, I'm calling this out because I want you guys to know that we do listen, all right? If you guys tweeted us, we probably will respond. So please be kind, because nothing but love here. But also, it's going to spark other questions. So the question was, basically, JBO was like, Gatekeeper bypass is not file quarantine. Like, why are you going over this? And it was like, ugh, you might be right. Let me look deeper into it. So we've already talked a little bit about Gatekeeper, right? So let's look at the way Gatekeeper is supposed to work. So you have your pure little unicorn, goes to the gate, right? Drunken Monkey Master checks the attribute, right? Do you have your attribute? Great, you have your attribute. Now we're going to go into code signing. Like, let's look in the saddlebags, like make sure your entitlements are correct. Let's go and make sure you have your developer ID, et cetera, et cetera. And then we're going to go through notarization. And that's essentially where it uses the Apple API Cloud Kit. It's going to call phone home. It's going to be like, hey, are you notarized? And if it doesn't have a ticket, it's going to download one off the Apple servers, right? Then you have XProtect. XProtect is not a part of Gatekeeper, but it does happen inside of this static analysis process. And that's essentially just a bunch of Yara signatures, right? Do you look like a panda? Yes or no? So, and then good to go, right? So below this, there's going to be your quarantine process, or to all of the references. A huge thank you to Howard Oakley, because I think he's probably one of the most well-documented blogs that I've found as far as the Eclectic Light Company, where it actually does legitimate breakdowns of what happens upon execution for Gatekeeper, then also what happens as far as notarization, what checks are actually done on execution for code signing, and he's got some really great decision flowcharts there. Those are all actually linked in these links, and I'll definitely release the slides afterwards. So we looked at our file quarantine. This is essentially the only process that we've really had covered in Gatekeeper. And so we're like, we should probably update that. So now we have a much more focus on components. So we kind of rerouted that, right, where it's much more of an ordered list. The reason why this is significant, right, is because we love our community engagement. But we started as, when you're maintaining attack, the difference of perspective is, what is the attacker really trying to do? Like, what will live past Apple's random updates and hardware changes, right? To where we can keep talking the same language and we're not having to update the dictionary, changing words all the time, because then it becomes useless. And on this one, we realized the adversary is just trying to bypass Gatekeeper. So we kind of put it all together and then just made a much more holistic picture of it. So as far as Apple goes, would really love it if you guys actually had a roadmap of some of these things. That'd be great. So how do pandas evade this, right? Just love the artwork. So Panda tries to get in the gate, right? He's got the file quarantine attribute, right? Well, if you're Ocean Lotus, which is not Chinese, but definitely does attack Chinese, they just remove this attribute. And then as far as code signing goes, if you're Schlayer, you just get your app signed and notarized. That's just how you bypass it. There's also other things, right? Like you take someone else's certificates, or sorry, developer, yeah. But for the most part, that's definitely been like a one-stop shop. So then you have your Yara checks. These are going to be, again, those Yara rules. What was interesting is that Erica, who's here, and Phil both had a report that came out where they were going over a really neat method that Schlayer used. And I call out Schlayer because the reality is, once something gets onto your macOS, it's kind of like open field for whatever else it wants to download, right? So a lot of times we see a lot of novelty in adware, which is annoying for most of us that are looking at the analysis of it. But because it's like the gateway malware, you kind of, once you get that execution, you can kind of download whatever you want. It can be a loader for anything. So for this one specifically, we actually added resource forking. Resource forking is actually a very old technology. For those of you that don't know, it's an extended attribute. We used to put like thumbnail images in it. but you can actually put whatever you want in it to include executable code, which is what Slayer did. They piped executable code at the end of, inside of our resource fork. So then the belief is that it would bypass signatures. So, and your Panda gets through. Now, one thing that kind of trumps all this, and we did a lot of double checking, so it was really reaffirming when I heard the presentation earlier that just confirmed this, because you get to this point when you get so down in these research rabbit holes, you're like, but did I miss something? Did I miss one like data entry or the database, or if it's in this database, if it's not in this database, check. And turns out one malware that's really popular is Essex, right? It's continued to evolve, but the reason why this is significant is because once it gains execution, which it usually comes in through a GitHub project or another method, what it does is it specifically puts its executable inside of apps that have already run. And the reason why that's significant is because Gatekeeper is a first check thing. And there was actually this whole Twitter thread actually on how Gatekeeper is great so long as it's never run before. The moment that app is already run, it's already inside of the database, and it doesn't go through a lot of these checks that we assume that it's supposed to go to. And there's a whole lot of misunderstanding based on our favorite feature of all companies' marketing. So, discovery. What does this look like on macOS, right? So now that our Panda's inside, what does discovery look like? Jaron, who is fantastic, released one of his old talks, and he put it back into blog format so we could actually cite it in attack. Thank you. Where it was Mac backdoored, and it really specifically went over Bonjour, right? So Bonjour is this fantastic zero configuration that Apple uses. What's really nice about it, like if you have AirPlay, right, your device just works. It just clicks, right? Like that's the whole point of it. And that is thank you, Bonjour. So the thing about it, though, is that you can also do a query if you want to find other Mac OSs that also have those services. So think of it like going up to a board and be like, hey, what services are available for me? Like, and you just kind of see, like, all of these guys are here ready for you if you want them. So we added that to the network discovery. So if you just do an MDNS query, you'll be able to see what services are available, other Mac machines that are also advertising SSH or whatever that might be. So, but let's say that's not your goal. Maybe your goal is not lateral movement. Maybe your goal is just to be able to be like Essex, like, and you want to find other things, or dial-up hijacking. Chris Ross and Patrick both did a dial-up hijacker scanner. I believe that's right. And basically what it was doing was looking for entitlements, right? So that is discovery in an essence. And so what you do is you essentially send out a query and then you pull back information that you want. The way that Essex does this is what they're looking for is very specifically apps that have sharing TCC permissions already enabled. And so if they have these permissions already enabled, they're not going to ask again. They already have it. So they'll take their malicious application and drop it in there, and then they'll be able to launch it without requesting any of these permissions again. So then it's inside the app, and then there's a whole nother story about taking over daemons and assuming their identity and then getting in the gate. So for another story. Another conversation that I was able to have throughout this year that OBTS from last year kind of brought up was with Brennan Dalton. So we had this, like, Cedric Owens, Patrick, and Jaron did a great talk last year, and it was all about application bundle manipulation. And so we really wanted to unpack that. Like, how do we turn what is an exploit into a repeatable adversary behavior and then verify that that's been done in the wild, right? Because that's the power of attack. It's done in the wild. Like, adversaries are using this. So how do we capture this, reframe it, so now we can talk about it clearly? And that was basically from his blog. He did this whole bundle of nerves where he took a couple of different malwares, analyzed them, and then kind of broke those out into how it's thwarting different security controls and mechanisms. And so you have your Panda. He wants to get the Jade tally, right? So how does he do this? Well, first he's going to unpack his other little pandas, aka threads, and they all have their own tasks. So the one technique that we added was, which I was actually shocked, it's almost one of those things when you're doing this, you're like, I thought we had that, until you realize you didn't have that, and then you had to go and create it, and then you're like, okay, now we have that. And this is one of those, where it's basically an embedded binary, right? Like, totally thought we had this. We did not have this in attack. We do now have this in attack as of the 25th. But these names might change, because we're kind of going back and forth on, like, binaries, payloads. So embedded binaries, that can be the resource fork, that can be be able to pack it at certain different points. If you want to talk about stripped payloads, which is where you basically have made it bytecode, that's where you basically take away any type of understanding of what the functionality or the program logic of it is. So some people have mentioned like they have reverse analysis, right, where all you get is essentially your bytecode. That's it. You don't have nothing that's human readable. That would be a stripped payload. And the reason why it's significant is because macOS OSA minor, which I know it's a minor, but what's interesting about this one is it was found, I want to say like 2018, but they actually, once they started doing the analysis on it, they actually realized it was in circulation since 2015, but they weren't even able to understand the logic of it until 2020. And the reason is because they had the Apple script disassembler, but they didn't have a decompiler to be able to translate the Apple event codes. So what happens a lot of times with these scripting languages is if it's a new scripting language, there has to be some type of like dictionary to be able to understand what's going on at this lower level. That if it's a brand new scripting language, it's probably not going to have that. For AppleScript, they had the one part, but they didn't have the other. And there's actually a whole lot of Chinese articles that if you actually read down, they were like, yeah, we can't analyze this anymore because they basically made a run-only Apple script, and I have no way to actually do the analysis on this. So the investigation stops here. And so Sentinel Labs actually released a decompiler that mapped everything to the Apple event codes. And so they were actually able to do some more analysis, which was fantastic. But because of that, that's kind of what drove these two techniques, because it was justification for like those run-only Apple scripts, which is those stripped binaries, and then also the embedded payloads, because what OSA minor did was that they would embed Apple scripts or run-only Apple scripts inside of other run-only Apple scripts, which just made it really hard for people to decompile and understand what was actually happening. So the next one is installer scripts. The reason why this is significant is because we were actually previously mapping this to AppleScript, which is a really, really broad topic. And for those of you that get really frustrated with mapping things to attack for macOS, it's understandable now because the way an installer works is actually really cross-platform related. It's not just macOS, it's Linux, it's GCC, it's all of these different methods to be able to deliver an application and have it installed. And there's a lot of different intricacies that go with this. For macOS specifically, it's going to be your pre and post installers. So back a couple of years ago at Mac Admins, they had this really great presentation that's linked in here where he was like, the way that macOS does installers is fantastic. And the reason why is because you can have a script that can prepare your environment, and then you can have a script maybe like to move your installer to the trash. So you literally have this entire nice process flow, right? Are you in the right environment? What dependencies do I need to download? And then you can have your actual application. It made it really portable, right? But then when you're an adversary, you're like, how do I use this portable to my advantage? Well, it's also very normal to be able to, when you're installing something, right, you're going to prompt for user credentials. Now, mind you, none of these are new things. Like, Apple Juice is really old, so we're clear. But Apple Juice was doing these post-installer scripts where basically it was already going to prompt you for your credentials to be able to download this Flash player. But then it was going to use a post-install script to be able to move its malicious binary into the launch daemons, which it already had the permissions for because you already gave your credentials to be able to install the application in the first place. And then it was going to be able to execute that. And so now you've got elevated privileges, and you've also got execution on your host. So we just started remapping that to be able to be a part of the installer packages. And the more we unpacked this, the more we kind of realized like how much of a broad thing this is. It's not scripts. It does use AppleScript, but it can use any scripts. So it's just the functionality of an actual installer package. So some big things that we had. I'll actually go over this because it's not in the slides because I didn't think I was going to have time with all the comics. But there's one more technique that we're really excited about, and that's going to be your socket listeners. Turns out you can actually do this on macOS as well, where if you look at different threat actors, specifically your BPF backdoor, which is a Linux-based malware that came out, what it does is actually sets up a BPF filter using libpcap, right? And the significance of this specific technique is that you don't want to actually do a full installation. All you're doing is adding a filter. And the way that they activate, these are more for like long-term backdoors. So if you're like, I want to come in 9 months and I don't want anyone to know about me, You can go in, you already have execution on the box, you're leaving persistence for a longer time. Then you install your filter using your libpcap library, and then you send a crafted packet later, which is traffic signaling technique for attack, and then that'll activate the actual installation. So it's like a really slick, long-term backdoor activation. But we just put that technique in for Linux, and then I was verifying it with some other different research developers, and you can absolutely do the same thing on macOS if you install that library. And the only reason why you'd have to install that library is just because the mock services run a little differently in the sockets. So fun new technique. But kind of key takeaways for this is attack is hands down community driven. So if you guys can take anything from this talk, know that all the changes that are happening in attack that you guys now can talk about are honestly a direct relation to any conversations that we've had together, any passion points that you all have talked about. They've been really, really helpful. And it's really helpful to know where we've gone right, but also where we've gone wrong and where we had opportunities to go better. If it's not an attack, it does not mean it's in the wild. There is absolutely a gap between reporting and actually getting published in attack. So I would say for those of you that have seen anything in the wild, there was like, I think we've all brought it up lately where it's like there's just not a lot of documentation. It'd be great if you guys publish that. Have no fear that it's not going to be good enough because it will be helpful to somebody. And if you reach out to me, we can definitely work on it. There's also been this pattern where everything's becoming really, really cross-platform. So most of the malware that I've seen, oh, it's also portable on Linux. Oh, it's also portable on macOS. My favorite one was one analysis report where it was like, yeah, this is on macOS, but we're going to do the Windows analysis. And it was just like, really? But yeah, as I said earlier, a roadmap for Gatekeeper would be great. Honestly, anything as far as security controls would be great. But just also a big call out to Howard and Phil. I used a lot of your reporting to verify and cross-check things. And so I just really appreciate the amount of time that you all have put into a lot of your reporting. There's others, but for the most part, that is that. Any questions? Crickets. Yeah, that sucks.
Is there a technique with the code processes? This seems to be, again, a cross-platform issue where we all love our GPUs and security management needs, et cetera. So that's cross-platform.
100%. So the thing about these techniques, right, and here's why they're kind of powerful, is there's a difference between an exploit and a repeatable behavior. So if this is a logical thing that the program is supposed to do, the operating system is supposed to do, then it's a repeatable behavior. But if this is like a memory leak that we can take advantage of, then we actually have two techniques for that. We have one where it's exploitation on the client side, and then we also have one that's exploitation on the operating system itself. And we've bucketed those two because there's no way, like there's a reason why CVEs is separate from attack techniques, right? Like we really wanted to capture like what can defenders defend against that's repeatable. Like there's nothing wrong with launch agents. Launch agents is great. There's nothing wrong with Apple scripts or run-only Apple scripts. The real power behind that is because there's nothing wrong with it. So how do you use something that's actually supposed to be there against the operating system itself? So no, the answer is yes and no. So nothing specifically, but yes, there is one technique that kind of we've bucketed into. Yeah, they're amazing, right? That's Chris Fleming. So Miscreants is the company. They're like a cybersecurity, cyber art kind of company, and Chris Fleming is the artist.
Okay, this is kind of a random question. What malware would you say has like mapped the most or influenced the most? Your favorite, maybe?
I mean, honestly, right now it's going to be Essex, just because like that has been the most recent one. It does the GitHub projects. I really like. I don't want to compliment malware, but it is slightly conflict is going on right here. Between the way it's actually used a lot of novel ideas, the application bundle manipulation, they're just really ahead of the curve as far as like understanding how the application bundles work, and then how to subvert that trust relationship. Because that's really what it is, right? It's a trust relationship. Your operating system wants to execute its app. That's like why Apple's so fantastic. It's because They're really focused on that user interaction and that seamless, like it just works. Like it's a very common quote that you'll hear with Apple, unlike Windows. So, and Essex absolutely abuses that relationship repeatedly in really neat, novel ways. And so that's probably my favorite one. All right, well, thank you guys so much. Oh, what's up? No, please. Chaba. My red teaming heart goes out to you right now. The question was, are we having any plans to be able to add red teaming techniques basically to attack? I know a lot of companies, what they have done is they've actually taken attack matrix and then they've built their own red teaming matrix on top of attack. I will probably never do red teaming techniques for attack purely for one reason only. Like the power of attack is that it's already been seen in the wild. And so there's a reason why companies invest so heavily in incredibly smart people that do red teaming. And it's because you guys are ahead of the curve for a very good reason. Like those researcher roles, that understanding of the macOS hardware at that byte level is not necessarily common. So most adversaries have the mentality of, well, if it works, do I really care? Whereas a lot of researchers are like, but what's the coolest way I could do this, right? Like I've got to pwn it all. So it's just a different mentality, but nothing for red teaming right now. But I would love to see that as a separate MITRE project maybe, where it's like red teaming techniques, but it's also slightly terrifying to even publish that. So yeah. Any other questions? All right, you guys have an amazing happy hour, and thank you so much.